In the first two parts of The Vampyre by John William Polidori, we saw the close links with the later Dracula, but in the end they start to deviate. There seems to be a trope in horror that could be solved by the protagonists thinking just a little bit more before acting, and this latter half certainly falls into that. In part 3, with the body of Lord Ruthven having vanished, and then discovering the sheath to the dagger that was found in the hovel, Aubrey returns home a broken man, but his oath comes back to haunt him. If you want to hear more, please click like, subscribing and clicking the bell, then all will let you know when a new episode releases. Let us know what you liked and what you want to see more of in the comments. You can even join us on Patreon. Dodger is back. If you spot him, post where in the comments, and the first correct one gets pinned to the top. For now though, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. He left Smyrna, and on his way home, at Rome, his first inquiries were concerning the lady he had attempted to snatch from Lord Ruthven's seductive arts. Her parents were in distress, their fortune ruined, and she had not been heard of since the departure of his lordship. Aubrey's mind became almost broken under so many repeated horrors. He was afraid that this lady had fallen victim to the destroyer of Ianthe. He became morose and silent, and his only occupation consisted in urging the speed of the positions, as if he were going to save the life of someone he held dear. He arrived at Calais. A breeze which seemed obedient to his will soon wafted him to the English shores, and he hastened to the mansion of his fathers, and there, for a moment, appeared to lose in the embraces and caresses of his sister all memory of the past. If she before, by her infantine caresses, had gained his affection, now that the woman began to appear, she was still more attaching as a companion. Miss Aubrey had not that winning grace which gains the gaze and applause of the drawing room assemblies. There was none of that light brilliancy which only exists in the heated atmosphere of a crowded apartment. Her blue eyes were never lit up by the levity of the mind beneath. There was a melancholy charm about it which did not seem to arise from misfortune, but from some feeling within that appeared to indicate a soul conscious of a brighter realm. Her step was not that light footing which strays where a butterfly or a colour may attract. It was sedate and pensive. When alone, her face was never brightened by the smile of joy. But when her brother breathed to her his affection, and would in her presence forget those griefs she knew destroyed his rest, who would have exchanged her smile for that of the voluptuary? It seemed as if those eyes, that face, were then playing in the light of their own narrative spheres. She was yet only 18 and had not been presented to the world, it having been thought by her guardians more fit that her presentation should be delayed until her brother's return from the continent, where he might be her protector. It was now, therefore, resolved that the next drawing room, which was fast approaching, should be the epoch of her entry into the busy scene. Aubrey would rather have remained in the mansion of his fathers and fed upon the melancholy which overpowered him. He could not feel interest about the frivolities of fashionable strangers, when his mind had been so torn by the events that he had witnessed. But he determined to sacrifice his own comfort in the protection of his sister. They soon arrived in town and prepared for the next day, which had been announced as a drawing room. The crowd was excessive. A drawing room had not been held for a long time, and all who were anxious to bask in the smile of royalty hastened thither. Aubrey was there with his sister, while he was standing in a corner by himself, heedless of all around him, engaged in the remembrance that the first time he had seen Lord Ruthven was in that very place. He felt himself suddenly seized by the arm, and a voice he recognized all too well sounded in his ear. "Remember your oath." He had hardly courage to turn, fearful of seeing a spectre that would blast him, when he perceived at a little distance the same figure which had attracted his notice on the spot upon his entry into society. He gazed till his limbs almost refusing to bear their weight. He was obliged to take the arm of a friend, and forcing a passage through the crowd, threw himself into his carriage and was driven home. He paced the room with hurried steps and fixed his hands upon his head as if he were afraid his thoughts were bursting from his brain. Lord Ruthven again before him. Circumstances started up in dreadful array. The dagger, his oath. He roused himself. He could not believe it possible. The dead rise again. He thought his imagination had conjured up the image in his mind was resting upon. It was impossible that it could be real. He determined, therefore, to go again into society, for though he attempted to ask concerning Lord Ruthven, the name hung upon his lips, and he could not succeed in gaining information. He went a few nights after with his sister to the assembly of a near relation. Leaving her under the protection of a matron, he retired into a recess and there gave himself up to his own devouring thoughts. Perceiving at last that many were leaving, he roused himself and, entering another room, found his sister surrounded by several, apparently in earnest conversation. He attempted to pass and get near her, when one whom he requested to move turned round and revealed to him those features he most abhorred. He sprang forward, seized his sister's arm, and, with hurried step, forced her towards the street. At the door he found himself impeded by the crowd of servants who were waiting for their lords, and while he was engaged in passing them, he again heard that voice whisper close to him, "Remember your oath." He did not dare to turn, but hurrying his sister soon reached home. Aubrey became almost distracted. If before his mind had been absorbed by one subject, how much more completely it was engrossed now that the certainty of the monsters living again pressed upon his thoughts. His sister's attentions were now unheeded, and it was in vain that she entreated him to explain to her what had caused his abrupt conduct. He only uttered a few words, and those terrified her. The more he thought, the more he was bewildered. His oath startled him. He was then to allow this monster to roam, bearing ruin upon his breast, amidst all he held dear, and not avert its progress? His very sister might have been touched by him, but even if he were to break his oath and disclose his suspicions, who would believe him? He thought of employing his own hand to free the world from such a wretch. But death, he remembered, had already been mocked. For days he remained in this state, shut up in his room. He saw no one, and ate only when his sister came in, who, with eyes streaming with tears, besought him for her sake to support nature. At last, no longer capable of bearing stillness and solitude, he left his house, roamed from street to street, anxious to fly that image which haunted him. His dress became neglected, and he wandered, as often exposed to the noonday sun as to the midnight damps. He was no longer to be recognised. At first he returned with the evening to the house, but at last he laid him down to rest wherever fatigue overtook him. His sister, anxious for his safety, employed people to follow him, but they were soon distanced by him who fled from a pursuer swifter than any from thought. His conduct, however, suddenly changed, struck by the idea that he left by his absence the whole of his friends, with a fiend amongst them of whose presence they were unconscious. He determined to enter again into society and watch them closely, anxious to forewarn, in spite of his oath, all whom Lord Ruthven approached with intimacy. But when he entered into a room, his haggard and suspicious looks were so striking, his inward shudderings so visible, that his sister was at last obliged to beg of him to abstain from seeking, for her sake, a society which affected him so strongly. When, however, remonstrance proved unavailing, the guardians thought proper to interpose, and fearing that his mind was becoming alienated, they thought it high time to resume again that trust which had been before imposed upon them by Aubrey's parents. Desirous of saving him from the injuries and suffering he had daily encountered in his wanderings, and of preventing him from exposing to the general eye those marks of what they considered folly, they engaged a physician to reside in the house and take constant care of him. He hardly appeared to notice it, so completely was his mind absorbed by one terrible subject. His incoherence became at last so great that he was confined to his chamber. He would often lie for days, incapable of being roused. He had become emaciated. His eyes had attained a glassy lustre. The only sign of affection and recollection remaining displayed itself upon the entry of his sister. Then he would sometimes start, and seizing her hands with looks that severely affected her, he would desire her not to touch him. "Oh, do not touch him. If your love for me is aught, do not go near him." When, however, she inquired to whom he referred, his only answer was, "True, true." And again he sank into a state whence not even she could rouse him. This lasted many months. Gradually, however, as the year was passing, his incoherences became less frequent, and his mind threw off a portion of its gloom, whilst his guardians observed that several times in the day he would count upon his fingers a definite number and then smile. The time had nearly elapsed when, upon the last day of the year, one of his guardians, entering his room, began to converse with his physician upon the melancholy circumstance of Aubrey's being in so awful a situation when his sister was going next day to be married. Instantly, Aubrey's attention was attracted. He asked anxiously to whom. Glad of this mark of returning intellect, of which they feared he had been deprived, they mentioned the name of the Earl of Marsden. Thinking this was a young earl whom he had met in society, Aubrey seemed pleased and astonished them still more by expressing his intention to be present at the nuptials and desiring to see his sister. They answered not, but in a few minutes his sister was with him. He was apparently again capable of being affected by the influence of her lovely smile, for he pressed her to his breast and kissed her cheek, wet with tears flowing at the thought of her brother's being once more alive to the feelings of affection. He began to speak with all his wonted warmth and to congratulate her upon her marriage with a person so distinguished for rank and every accomplishment, when he suddenly perceived a locket upon her breast. Opening it, it was his surprise at beholding the features of the monster who had so long influenced his life. He seized the portrait in a paroxysm of rage and trampled it underfoot. Upon her asking him why he had thus destroyed the resemblance of her future husband, he looked at her as if he did not understand her. Then, seizing her hands and gazing on her with the frantic expression of countenance, he bade her swear that she would never wed this monster, but he could not advance. It seemed as if that voice against him bade him remember his oath. He turned suddenly round, thinking Lord Ruthven was near him, but saw no one. In the meantime, the guardians and the physician, who had heard the whole and thought this was the return of his disorder, entered and, forcing him from Miss Aubrey, desired her to leave him. He fell upon his knees to them. He implored, he begged of them to delay but for one day. They, attributing this to the insanity they imagined had taken possession of his mind, endeavoured to pacify him and retired. Lord Ruthven had called the morning after the drawing room and had been refused with everyone else. When he heard of Aubrey's ill health, he readily understood himself to be the cause of it. But when he learned that he was deemed insane, his exultation and pleasure could hardly be concealed from those among whom he had gained this information. He hastened to the house of his former companion, and by constant attendance and the pretence of great affection for the brother and interest in his fate, had gradually won the ear of Miss Aubrey. Who could resist his power? His tongue had dangers and toils to recount, could speak of himself as of an individual having no sympathy with any being on the crowded earth, save with her to whom he addressed himself. He could tell how, since he knew her, his existence had begun to seem worthy of preservation, if it were merely that he might listen to her soothing accents in fine. He knew so well how to use the serpent's art, or such as the will of fate, that he gained her affection. The title of the elder branch falling at length to him, he obtained an important embassy, which served as an excuse for hastening the marriage, in spite of her brother's deranged state, which was to take place on the very day before his departure for the continent. Aubrey, when he was left by the physician and his guardians, attempted to bribe the servants, but in vain. He asked for pen and paper. It was given to him. He wrote a letter to his sister, conjuring her as she valued her own happiness, her own honour, and the honour of those now in the grave, who once held her in their arms as their hope and the hope of their house, to delay but for a few hours that marriage on which he denounced the most heavy curses. The servants promised that they would deliver it, but giving it to the physician, he thought it better not to harass any more the mind of Miss Aubrey by what he considered the ravings of a maniac. Night passed on without rest to the busy inmates of the house, and Aubrey heard with a horror that may more easily be conceived than described the notes of busy preparation. Morning came and the sound of carriages broke upon his ear. Aubrey grew almost frantic. The curiosity of the servants at last overcame their vigilance. They gradually stole away, leaving him in the custody of a helpless old woman. He seized the opportunity with one bound, was out of the room, and in a moment found himself in the apartment where all were nearly assembled. Lord Ruthven was the first to perceive him. He immediately approached and, taking his arm by force, hurried him from the room, speechless with rage. When, on the staircase, Lord Ruthven whispered into his ear, "Remember your oath, and know, if not my bride today, your sister is dishonoured. Women are frail." So saying, he pushed him towards his attendants, who, roused by the old woman, had come in search of him. Aubrey could no longer support himself. His rage, not finding vent, had broken a blood vessel, and he was conveyed to bed. This was not mentioned to his sister, who was not present when he entered, as the physician was afraid of agitating her. The marriage was solemnised, and the bride and bridegroom left London. Aubrey's weakness increased. The effusion of blood produced symptoms of the near approach of death. He desired his sister's guardians might be called, and when the midnight hour had struck, he related composedly what the reader has pursued. He died immediately thereafter. The guardians hastened to protect Miss Aubrey, but when they arrived, it was too late. Lord Ruthven had disappeared, and Aubrey's sister had glutted the thirst of a vampire. So ends The Vampire. I struggled a little with this one, as though the pain and suffering is standard in horror, as with Dracula, the evil is finally defeated in the end. In this case, Lord Ruthven escapes to continue his crimes. I didn't like that. What did you think? Which do you prefer? I'd be interested to hear what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. If you spotted Dodger, don't forget to post in the comments. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell. But think, when is it okay to break an oath? And is an oath forced in bad faith truly something you should hold on to?